Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Keith Tidball. Dr. Tidball is joining us as part of our David Everett Post-Conflict Reconstruction Speaker Series. I think you'll find that he brings a fresh and very interdisciplinary perspective to the topic of post-conflict studies, one that we don't examine all that often. Dr. Tidball's professional efforts focus on the interaction between humans and nature in the context of disasters and war. Like I said, a little different. He's particularly interested in how these interactions relate to social, ecological system resilience, or in other words, how humans and their interactions with nature are related to systems' ability to bounce back after being disturbed. The day job that allows Dr. Tidball to do this important work is at Cornell University. He is the Senior Extension Associate in the Department of Natural Resources, where he serves as Associate Director of the Civic Ecology Lab and Program Leader for the Nature and Human Security Program. He is also the State Coordinator for the New York Extension Disaster Education Network. Dr. Tidball brings a broad base of experiences to his work. He took a turn at military service in the U.S. Army and the National Guard. He has significant Red Cross training in disaster and humanitarian assistance. He does extraordinary work with our nation's veterans, which I think he'll mention in the talk. And he's a prolific writer. And I was actually wondering if you were starting to compete with Professor Banks for how heavy I counted over 24 peer-reviewed articles, a dozen book chapters either printed or in development, and another couple dozen reports and publications that you use for program outreach purposes. So
thanks for coming.
You don't even look that old.
You're welcome to come forward. There seems to be a few seats available down here, and I'm going to be lonely after a little while. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kelly, and thank you for hosting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here and amongst you all today. Nobody's ever counted my publications before. That's pretty cool. I appreciate that. As Kelly said, I am at Cornell University, just down the road, in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Department of Natural Resources. It's my pleasure to be a part of this particular series, the Everett Post-Conflict Reconstruction Speaker Series. A lot of the work that I've done, both in research and extension, has been in reconstruction, and the reason that I care about this is that both as a military person at one point back in the 90s, later as a Foreign Agriculture Service employee, and even now I see that the value that people have with natural resources and their environment is an important component of reconstruction, recovery, and resilience. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that in the next few moments. Since there's not a lot of us in the room, I will hold questions till the end, but there may be moments where it feels appropriate to engage you a little bit, so don't be shocked if I call upon you to chime in a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to be using this guy. So the initial question, and the nice thing about this kind of talk, by the way, this is kind of a book talk. So the nice thing about this is I can be a little more reflexive, and share with you sort of what my motivations are and my experiences rather than presenting data and giving you, sort of the classic sort of academic talk. And I'm going to do that. So the initial question here is, what does this sort of green, verdant backdrop have to do with this? Obviously not, at least in that particular flash of a moment, peaceful, green, verdant backdrop. What do those things have to do with each other? And that is fundamentally what we're going to pursue today with this book talk, the book being Greening in the Red Zone, and also, in a larger sense, a lot of my work. So what I've been doing for the last probably 15 years is pursuing these two questions as a result of what I experienced in my prior career. First, why do humans turn to nature and restoring nature in the wake of conflict or in disaster? Why do they do this? And in this book, we've documented many, many cases of people actually doing this. And then the next question, what use is that? What use is this greening or greening in red zones that people are engaging in terms of human vulnerability and security? And how can we think about that in terms of managing social ecological complexity and that system's resilience and transitions to peace, or at least to a steady state? So that's kind of setting the stage. That's where we're headed today in this conversation. Just by way of background, you know, we're all listening to the news. We understand that there's a great deal of population growth, especially in developing countries. You add that with a conversation, no matter what your politics or theology is about climate change, certainly the intensity and frequency of severe events are on the rise. And you add that to resource scarcity issues. In my mind, that is a recipe for kind of inevitable red zones. And whether you look at, sorry, this image is a little small. This is the State Fragility Index for 2011. Whether you look at the sort of propagation of violence and fragile states, or you look at just the disaster side of the equation, there is no question that the trends at least seem to be that we're headed towards a significant increase in our need to respond to these kinds of red zones. So the book. This is the book. It's published by Springer. It's too expensive. I don't understand how a book is supposed to sell when it costs over $100 for a copy of it. You know, I just don't understand the economics of that. But if you're interested in chapters specifically, or you're interested in portions of this book, please email me. And also, if you can agitate for your library to carry this book, and most of them have memberships to Springer, that's a better way to access this. Most libraries are now putting this online. So if they get it, it's not a matter of going to the library and checking it out. You can get it through the electronic version. So the book, the main premise of the book is that creation and access to green spaces promotes not only individual human health, which one would expect, but especially in sort of therapeutic contexts, and we see that there's a huge literature on that. But more importantly, what's the role of access to green space and the act of creating and caring for these green spaces in social health, the larger context, societal scales, and well-being? So this book basically is asserting that creation and access to these green spaces confers resilience and recovery in systems that are traumatized or perturbed by some sort of either conflict or disaster. It's an edited volume. My colleague Marianne Krasny and I spent a lot of time chasing this question and finding there's 35 chapters in this book, probably 30 of which are case studies of examples, both from disaster and conflict, of how interaction with natural resources or management of natural resources, especially community-based management of natural resources, plays in these sort of red zones in this context. And contributes, or might contribute, to resilience, resistance, recovery, and this larger idea of resilience of social ecological systems, linked systems. So, you heard a little bit about me from Kelly. The question of how is it that I came to pursue this question, or these kinds of questions? What sort of, you may be interested in this as scholars, as students. How did I get here? How did I get to this? Any Tropic Thunder fans? Remember the great sequence about I know who I am? I'm the dude playing another dude who thinks he's another dude. Well, I'm doing a little better than that. I recognize who I am and how it influences how I got to here. And this is an interesting painting. I found this painting in South Africa in an antique store. I'm sorry that this one's a little darker. Hopefully you're able to see that better on that one. This looks like a normal landscape painting, but if you look closely in the middle there, you see a soldier with his firearm and his helmet, sort of looking around. He's by himself. That's sort of strange. And he's sort of admiring the landscape. Who knows what he's supposed to be doing there, but that appears to be what he's doing. I relate to this. Starting in my early childhood, I grew up in rural Minnesota. It's a great place to hunt and fish, and I enjoyed that. And then suddenly, my father was a minister. He decided that we needed to go address all the ails of Detroit, Michigan in the 80s. Murder capital of the world and all the rest that goes with that. So I was plucked out of some idealistic sort of place like this and plopped into downtown Detroit. My first red zone And from there, while there, I realized that there was an incredible value of finding just little pockets of green space just to sort of escape this even for a few moments. And slowly I found places to fish, and there were actually fish in the Detroit River and the Rouge River. And so and I didn't know what it was, but at that time experienced these benefits of finding these green spaces in my own red zone. Later, I went off to college from there in Michigan. The rules changed in NCAA 3 football in terms of who you could get money from. So I needed to go find a way to pay for college. GI Bill was calling. I went in, enlisted in the Army in Detroit, found myself in places like Fort Benning, Georgia, and Fort Knox, and often was that guy. You know, I was good at what I did. I was training, but I was also like, man, this is a pretty cool environment. And when I had any free time, which there wasn't a lot of, I tried to find ways to appreciate those environments. And they gave me energy. They gave me the ability to continue on in my mission. And that stayed with me. I later got hurt and was no longer able to pursue my dreams in the military, but I wanted to continue to serve. So I ended up in the Foreign Service, in the Foreign Agriculture Service, doing post-conflict and post-disaster work in natural resources and agriculture. And in those contexts especially, I began to see that people's relationship with their landscape and with nature are a critical component to reconstruction. I'm going to grab some water here. And so, in recognizing or realizing that, I started to ask some questions about the way we were conducting business, the way the U.S. government and our allies were bringing aid and assistance to bear. Because it didn't seem like they were considering this key point of people's relationships with their own natural environment, or asking about what those relationships might be. And I felt like, wow, there's something missing in the equation. And so that's the genesis of this work. And I hope to be able to return to that as we talk today, and perhaps leave some time at the end to discuss that a little further. Pardon me, I do have a bit of a cold, so I'm fighting through a little of that. So these are just some pictures of progress. My favorite picture representing the old days is the top middle one. This is me reinventing myself, basically, at the Southern African Wildlife College, trying to make the transition from park rangers being just guys riding around on a bike saying, over here is X, Y, and Z facet of our park, to actually using military tactics to try to protect endangered species and train them to be able to do that. So I was part of the Southern African Wildlife College's transition into making rangers into rangers, making them into people who knew what to do in order to protect, for example, rhinoceros from pretty well-armed guys that want to come in and poach them. And then I was able to work with some pretty interesting people from Cornell University who had some similar experiences. And at the transition between the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, was able to take a position at Cornell University, which is how I am in front of you now. And to bring all of these experiences that I've just described, and I appreciate your patience and tolerance for listening to my little story. And if you were all up here, we could have a campfire, because there's just a nice little intimate group here. That's how this greening in the red zone actually begins. That's how that gets started. For those of you that are students, hopefully that is an interesting path, that just, how one gets to the point of writing a book like this, and hopefully a book that makes some sort of a difference. Now I'm at Cornell. I wish Cornell looked like this today. It doesn't. It looks kind of like here, kind of Arctic. And you see that middle picture there is the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. College of Agriculture and Life Sciences is an interesting place to be, given the work that you all are interested in or in doing. The College of Ag and Life Sciences at Cornell is pretty forward-thinking in that it understands that there's a role for agriculture and life sciences in conflict, post-conflict, reconstruction, and those kinds of things. Trying to think a little more into the future about what those roles might need to be for those kinds of contexts. So let's get into some definitions now. And for a little while, this talk is going to swing towards a little more academic, and then we can pull out at the last. Red zones, what are they? This refers, you probably instinctively know what it is. But these are these either spatial or temporal locations or time periods where the proverbial doo-doo is hitting the fan. I mean, this isn't hard. This is either post-disaster or post-conflict. This is where people are threatened, resources are threatened, economies are threatened, and so forth. But it's important to point out that it's not just spatial. There are time periods that are red zones for people. And so there's an application for that as we talk about this a little further. Obviously, the images there are probably not unfamiliar. 9/11, the Pentagon. At that time, I lived just a few blocks from the Pentagon on Pennsylvania Avenue in southeast capital area of Washington, D.C. Later in the middle there, you see that we're engaged in Iraq at this point, and then another image, more of a disaster image of the tsunami, earthquake, tsunami, and then later nuclear incident in Japan. Those are examples of red zones. Greening, the other part of the equation, what are some examples of greening? This may be sort of intuitive as well, but let's unpack it a little bit. Greening in this particular context is not just being out there in a park or a pretty place. It's active, integrated, and a kind of approach to stewardship and management of these living elements of a social ecological system. And it doesn't just take place out there somewhere in a national park or in the quote-unquote wilderness. It happens in cities, it happens in towns, townships, slums, on the battlefield. I don't know, has anybody heard of the book Defiant Gardens? Kenny Helphand writes about soldiers' experience doing greening activities from in front of their hooch or their tent or in the trenches in World War II. The concentration camps is an excellent book, a really interesting look at that particular snapshot of greening and in a particular kind of red zone. Important to point out that the greening sites vary. They could be little tiny woodlands just around the corner, public or private little parks, even community gardens. Some of you might have seen, especially in New York City, here in Syracuse. Street tree and those kinds of projects along plantings, botanic gardens, arboretums, cemeteries would qualify. Even whole forests and national or even international peace parks would be sites for greening. And the key piece that I want to point out here is this notion of active participation with nature and in human or civil society. And there's a little citation there, Tidball and Krasny, 2007, having to do with greening and civic ecology and civic society. Also, there's a couple of papers, and I mentioned these to Kelly earlier today, about environment shaping or the need to consider greening. When you're going to bring aid and assistance into a community, what do they want? How do you shape the environment so that it's receptive for that assistance or reconstruction work? And greening can be an important component of that. So the takeaways here are that this is an active approach, and it requires participation with nature and with civic society. That should cover us for definitions. Now, what are some examples? Examples that I've been involved with and that have documented in this book are both domestic and international. One great example is the restoration of Iraq's wetlands. This was a community-based natural resource project among Iraq's marsh Arabs in partnership with the scientific community. There's been a lot of controversy about that activity, but at the end of the day, it is an example, whatever it means in terms of international politics, it is an example of greening in a red zone and how actively engaging with those natural environments means something, and what could we, the United States or our allies, what could we learn by that involvement, by that kind of activity? Other examples, replanting of the urban forest in Sarajevo is a great example after the conflict there, and we talked a little bit about that today with my colleague. There is an incredible chapter, not written by me, by a couple of colleagues of mine, about the replanting of those urban forests in this Greening in the Red Zone book. If you're interested in that particular conflict, I'd highly recommend that from those two. Living memorials. After 9/11, the U.S. Forest Service recognized that lots of people wanted to do something with nature in order to cope in order to remember people lost, in order to think about the future, et cetera. Then they started creating memorials, not first in New York City and Washington, D.C., and then later all across the country. That is an excellent example of greening, and there is a website, if you're interested in that, the USDA's Forest Service Living Memorials Project. Very interesting. By the way, these examples are also chapters in the book. The establishment of Bandi Amir National Park, the first national park in Afghanistan, is a classic example of greening in the red zone at a much larger scale. That is a beautiful place. There are some beautiful photographs of that in the Greening in the Red Zone book, and also I think the author of that has now got a small website where he's talked about the sort of participatory process that was used and how that might be a model for other sort of participatory engagement in Afghanistan. And then also conservation efforts in these larger sort of demilitarized border zones, whether we're in Korea or the area between Greece and Cyprus. Those would also qualify as interesting examples of greening in the red zone context. A little closer to home, as a result of the publication of this book, which basically was done and off to the printer in 2012, my mission now is to chase down empirical evidence and documentation of the case studies that we present in this book. The cases are basically tentative hypotheses and the beginning of evidence that this greening in the red zone occurs and that we should pay attention to it and incorporate it into the way we pursue policy and reconstruction and SSTR, whatever the current vernacular is for that kind of work. This work, REWARS, Returning Warriors Outdoor Recreation, Restoration, and Resilience Study, is one effort to generate some of this empirical evidence that interaction with the outdoors, greening, as I've just defined it, is an important component of not only individual recovery and resilience, but also societal recovery and resilience. What I'm going to do now is, this is a great opportunity for me to have a little drink, show you about a 4-minute video from some of the work that we're doing with this project. It's interesting, Field and Stream and the sort of outdoor recreation community at large have really bought into this right out of the gate. They are on board, they understand it. And there are a lot of veterans, current servicemen and women, and especially combat wounded veterans getting interested and getting involved in this. In fact, we're having a hard time managing demand for this kind of stuff. So I want you to get a little snapshot of what this is, and this is exemplary of this idea of greening in the red zone. I think it's going to come up right over there. If you're looking to reconnect after a deployment, then you need to get out in nature.
So you feel more comfortable because you're not comfortable anyplace else.
Hi, I'm Kelly Gotch with Field and Stream. Today I'm in Phillips, Wisconsin at the 410-acre property known as Camp Hackett. This camp is operated by the Wounded Warriors in Action Foundation, a nonprofit group that creates opportunities for Purple Heart recipients to hunt, fish, and enjoy the outdoors.
Quick point, this is not the Wounded Warriors Project. This is the Wounded Warriors in Action Foundation, a very, very different organization. In case you may know who Wounded Warriors Project is, this is not them. That's it.
Volunteers on this Hero for a Day project will work alongside combat wounded veterans to help manage wildlife habitat at Camp Hackett. Leading our heroes today is John McDaniel, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and founder of Wounded Warriors in Action.
The Wounded Warriors in Action serves our nation's combat wounded Purple Heart recipients by providing world-class outdoor sporting activities. We have with us today 6 Purple Heart recipients. We're dedicating this day to conservation and habitat improvement. Lots of work going on today.
Today what we're trying to do is provide some habitat for ruffed grouse, white-tailed deer, and a whole host of non-game critters.
All habitat that is good for ruffed grouse is good for deer. If you give them food, water, and a hiding place. Those 3 things will have deer come in here.
It's kind of cool to stick them in the ground and, to watch them go from little trees to, till they mature.
They're going to provide some excellent winter habitat for all types of wildlife.
99 more to go.
We're trying to be good stewards of the land here.
Putting in a food plot for the deer. It's a big project, but with a lot of hands, it gets done in a hurry.
Maintaining healthy populations of white-tailed deer, ruffed grouse, and other fish and game at Camp Hackett is vital to execute the Foundation's mission of taking returning servicemen back into the field.
Had an explosion about 3 foot away from me, chewed up my leg from my hip down, and received.
Was sitting in the back of a car and shot me 5 times in the chest and twice in the arm.
Basically got blown up by an IED, lost vision in my left eye, some trauma to my...
I've got a really hard time being around other people.
I was really standoffish.
Just having a difficult time reintegrating. We had a very tough deployment.
There's wounds that you can't see. They come to a place like this where they can feel safe.
I went turkey hunting with Matt, who's real closed off, sheltered.
I felt very uncomfortable. Josh and I started to talk.
And by the end of the weekend, Matt just came around. He did a 180.
That was the turning point. I was transformed.
We have a chance to come out here, be conservationists and hunt and fish, and I think that accelerates the healing process.
There's no therapy, there's no medication that they can give you that comes close to the healing that Wounded Warriors in Action does.
Recovery stories seem to all include these relationships with nature.
Working in the dirt, seeing the fruits of their labor, that's all part of the healing process.
The guys here are really, really humble, and camaraderie is awesome.
We've all bled, so we're blood brothers. So we've got a common bond.
The environment really helps to get them away from what other experiences that they've had.
Grouse habitat and whitetail habitat. It's neat that they can lend that to the whole experience, rehabilitating.
We feel honored to be here to help with this. They have done above and beyond for all of us.
It's more for us what we can do for them.
Well, I think so often members of the community don't know how they can give back to those who have given so much to them. And today is an amazing opportunity for people who love to hunt and fish themselves, can give in a very unique and special way.
I learned more today about conservation than I have my entire life.
Field and Stream's recognizing us as heroes it's unreal.
We planted over 300 trees today. The landscape's been changed, and I hope the heroes learned a lot.
Thanks to the efforts of today's volunteers, there will be more hunting opportunities for the veterans who visit Camp Hackett. These heroes have improved habitat so that wildlife may continue to thrive, and John McDaniel's organization can continue to give back to servicemen and women who have been wounded in action. Go to fieldandstream.com to find out about volunteer opportunities near you. And join us in judge.
The emphasis here is not hunting or fishing. It's conservation activities, greening activities, as we defined them earlier. And I think that there's a lot of organizations working in this domain right now. The important thing is, what's the lesson learned? What is going on here in terms of returning combatants and how reintegration should occur, whether you're talking about U.S. troops or others? What's the underlying thing that I don't think I've seen in any of the papers from any of the security journals? The underlying thing being getting outdoors and interacting with that landscape and doing something to restore its sense of place, its sense of efficacy, and all that is an important component of not only individual healing, but perhaps healing of that landscape, healing of that society. These are ideas that seem so intuitive and so basic, but we're having quite a disconnect at the policy level in moving those ideas into actual reconstruction policy. And so what I'm going to move to now is, in just a few moments, you'll see how I'm working to work with some of my colleagues in academia and in the policy circles to try to think through that based on lessons that we can learn from videos like this. and from lots of these other case studies. But I'm going to move on. You know, we're talking about evidence now, and that, I hope, looks like some evidence, very sort of anecdotal evidence, but it's evidence nonetheless. What are some other kinds of evidence of the importance of greening in these sorts of contexts? Now, again, these are generally, with the exception of one book here, these are generally not applied to the security context like I and perhaps some of you would like to see. But there are lots of scientific journals about the value of horticultural therapy. That's plant interaction. Lots of journal articles about wildlife and outdoor recreation sort of therapy. That, again, is at an individual level. A couple of scholarly books, a few of which I want to point to here. This one especially, this is, I'm pointing here, you can't see it on that one. This is the one here, Environmental Peacemaking. Conca and DeBelko. This book is, you know, one of the sort of groundbreaking books on the concept of using environmental issues as peacemaking approaches at the scale of nation states, not the scale of individuals. So that's one I would point to. I did mention Defiant Gardens before. Kenny Helpan, that's what the book looks like in case you want to find that on Amazon.com, and you can. And then there's this pretty recent publication here, Assessing and Restoring Natural Resources in Post-Conflict Peace Building. Also another scholarly book that's beginning to touch on some of these themes that I think are of critical importance and that we're basically addressing in case study form in greening in the red zone. So a little bit more about the book. I'm sorry, they look smaller than I expected, but those are locations and red zone types that are covered in the book. This is sort of your teaser. You see Afghanistan there. Obviously, we'd have that there. There's at least 2 chapters dealing with that. Berlin in the post-Cold War context is one of the chapters. Charleston is a classic sort of hurricane natural disaster example where greening was an important component. Cyprus, the demarcation line between Greece and Turkey, and so forth. There's a whole list of them there. One of the ones I'm also very impressed with in that book is the Tokyo and Hiroshima example of the value of greening in the reconstruction of those cities in post-World War II. So. And also, if you're interested in this, if this at any level is of interest to you, the Greening in the Red Zone book now has its own sort of Facebook page and website and Twitter. You can find those easily with a Google search if you're interested in. Basically what's happening now is many of the authors and many sort of fans of this particular approach are putting their own stories of greening now out there to support some of these chapters in the book. So the question is, why should we do this? Why should we even consider greening or these sort of community-based natural resource management approaches in the discussion of post-conflict reconstruction or management? One important societal reason is because it contributes to or rebuilds a shared sense of identity and rebuilding that identity after a crisis. That's important. If you're talking about environment shaping or shaping the landscape wherein you hope to target reconstruction aid or assistance, then rebuilding these identities is important unless you like to manage riots. And often natural resources and scarcity of natural resources are one of the reasons that people will become violent very quickly. So there's a real important fundamental reason for doing this. It also leads to improved psychological, cognitive, and social health. Now again, we might be thinking more specifically here about returning combatants and the activities that might need to be done for returning combatants in the larger reconstruction or recovery process. This notion of fostering a deeper sense of self-worth is also important. As certain branches of the military and the State Department are worried about morale issues on the ground, there are some incredible implications for greening in the red zone when thinking about morale, community morale. This kind of approach also, we have found and are continuing to find, serves as a basis for framing place meanings. And sometimes place meanings are what is the fact, what is the contested fact. And so there's sometimes, through that book I mentioned, Environmental Peacemaking, using greening and natural resources as a way to come to some sort of consensus about place meaning is an important consideration for why we should do it. Also, let's not forget the value of restarting ecosystem services and the functionality of the ecosystem itself within which the activities we're attempting to deploy are occurring. The ecosystem needs to recover in a post-crisis, post-conflict, or even post-disaster context. So there's that reason. And people's involvement in restarting or recatalyzing ecosystem service production that they will benefit from means that they're buying in, that you're getting the kind of buy-in you want out of the local community in a reconstruction sort of environment. And importantly, because these quote-unquote greeners often begin to form partnerships with NGOs and others, that contributes to additional benefits if you're at all interested in these sort of polycentric governance approaches to places that have encountered or experienced perturbations of this magnitude. So those are some justifications. If you're a systems thinker or you're interested in system thinking, there are also some systems implications. We know that big crises opens up opportunities for renewal. How many people are familiar in this room with the adaptive cycle or diagrams like this thing here? Anybody seen that before? That is a heuristic diagram that's basically there to show what a cycle of a system is, the entire system moving through some sort of transition period. There are 4 quadrants. You can see that it's sort of an infinity loop with the twists here, which are like Mobius strips kind of. So things change at least twice in this system. Each of the quadrants represents a different phase of the existence of that system. Buzz Halling of the Resilience Alliance was the one who founded this idea or put it on paper. He was really talking about spruce budworm invasions in the pine forests of the Northeast, but it has since been deployed in a number of African social ecological contexts and elsewhere. And just briefly, this is the reorganization phase, conservation phase, release phase, and exploitation phase. Generally, the system is moving in this direction. And it might just stay in this sort of steady state, or it might come through and exit into a smaller iteration, or it can exit here into a larger iteration of itself, expansive or contracting. The important thing here is what happens in this back loop after the system flips the red zone is where all the interesting stuff is. And that's exactly the place where people whose job it is to work in reconstruction are going to find themselves operating, for the most part, is in the back loop of the adaptive cycle. So from a system standpoint, it would be very important to understand what is going on in system dynamics terms in a social ecological system in the back loop. And that's a conversation, that's another hour. We won't have that conversation now, but I wanted to at least show you this if you're interested in this sort of social ecological systems thinking. The main thing is that this is where the red zone occurs, and this is, in the back loop, is where people's interest in these kinds of greening activities may occur. And so what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about, I'm going to skip this, how this actually works. What are some of the mechanisms at work that would provide the impetus for getting going with greening in the red zone? We have identified 5, and then there'll be a 6th one that you'll see at the end that's sort of a culmination of all these. These 5 things, and I'm just going to go through these briefly, are what we feel in the Civic Ecology Lab are what explains at the individual and sort of community level, societal scale, how this greening in red zones gets going. One is urgent biophilia. Biophilia is a term that was coined by Fromm as a psychologist and later E.O. Wilson as a biologist. What basically means is that we have an innate, evolutionary perhaps, love of other life. We love life. We want to affiliate with other life. That is pretty well muted in the 20th and 21st century, except when a disaster or some sort of crisis or conflict occurs, it comes roaring back. And maybe that has to do with our biology. Maybe that has to do with the landscape. We're not sure, but we have documented that it does come roaring back. If you're interested in that concept, for each of these 5 mechanisms, you see on the right there's a peer-reviewed academic journal paper that will talk about each of these mechanisms if you're interested. The next mechanism is restorative topophilia. Not only do we love life and want to affiliate with other life, we also love our place. We have a sense of place, and there are place attachments. And so another mechanism for why greening in the red zone might happen is that people want to restore their place. They want to get it back or even improve it because they're attached to it. It's part of their own identities. And again, there's a paper, that's a pretty recent paper, on that concept. Interestingly, urgent biophilia and restorative topophilia are kind of hand in hand. They're like yin and yang. They work together. We don't usually find one without the other. So that's an interesting complex. We've called that the positive dependency complex. That's part of the title of that paper. If you're interested in that, I'd be happy to share that paper with you. A third mechanism, memorialization. You see this all over the world. We saw it after 9/11. Memorialization is an important motivation for getting going with kind of greening in the red zone activities. And if you screw this up, as a reconstruction person, if you mess up this memorialization thing and get in the way of it, you're in trouble. People are going to be seriously upset with you. They may choose not to think that what you're doing is very credible anymore because you've interfered with this sort of very fundamental level mechanism. We saw examples of this early in Iraq, the second Iraq, this last 10 years, where important icons were destroyed by various sides of the conflict. That was a problem, and it's still a problem, and it's going to be a problem. So this memorialization mechanism and all that it means in terms of symbols is important. That leads to this fourth mechanism, the social ecological symbols and rituals. These are not just social symbols, these are social-ecological symbols, meaning there are aspects of the landscape, living landscape, that come to be symbolic of a person or people's identity. And you can either use that to your advantage or you can suffer the consequences of destroying it. And both have occurred in recent history. Again, a paper to support that. And finally, this notion of discourses of defiance. Perfect example of this is New Orleans. New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the press could not wait to call New Orleans a failure of resilience and all kinds of other failure kinds of terms. In the end, it turns out that there were a number of people living there in New Orleans that didn't agree with that assessment and began to do a whole lot of greening in the red zone. And I think that the judgment now is that New Orleans is probably a good example of a resilient city as a result of what they experienced and how they've come back from that, especially when it comes to natural resource management and examples thereof. So discourses of defiance, the final mechanism. And the combination of these mechanisms is basically how we explain how this gets started. How does greening in the red zone actually transpire? The larger finding from this work with greening in the red zone and now the ongoing sort of empirical support of that is that it does appear that there is this sort of greening in the red zone process or cycle, which I'm going to walk you through real quick in just a moment. But it's nuanced. It's unique in every place, and it reinvents itself in every place. So you have to find a way to, as Kelly and I were talking about earlier, get your boots on the ground and go listen for a while to understand how that cycle is going to manifest itself in where the X is, where you're going to be in a reconstruction context, a disaster recovery context, and so forth. That's finding number one. So this is, man, hard to see. This is a kind of cycle that represents the way this works. Starting here, you see the, come on. This is sort of the perturbance. This is the beginning of the cycle. From there, what this is trying to indicate is lots of individual people are going to start gravitating towards available green assets as a result of these 5 mechanisms. They're going to run around in sort of a chaotic environment. They're going to finally locate some available green assets to use. They will then begin to cluster together. Here you see these little clusters right in here. They start clustering together and forming what we call communities of practice. They start independent of what the rules are, or what the government is saying, or what occupiers are saying, or whomever. They start doing their own thing. And it's a fact of life that whoever's involved there would probably like to know what they're up to and use those as assets. So they start usually restoring and creating new green assets, generally speaking, across these case studies and others. And then a larger greening movement begins to emerge through a series of feedbacks that happen right in here. These larger greening movement begin, they attract more people, they start working on recovering and restoring their sense of place, including the environmental assets of that, and that starts to feed back on itself right here, and continues to feedback and feedback and feedback. What then happens is you have more sites. They've just produced more sites, more important trees, more community gardens, more veterans programs, whatever it is for returning combatants. And these sites then become a magnet. They become a basin of attraction for recruiting more people to do this kind of thing. And that system then expands and starts over. And you see this cycle keep going and expanding over time. Obviously, the question is, if you know this is happening, what can you do about that? What value is there in knowing that these kinds of cycles are happening on the X, wherever it is that you're doing intervention work? And keep in mind that those processes are social ecological processes and are contributing something to the social ecological system's resilience, presumably, or lack thereof, depending on how it's managed. So the second finding then is that these greening in the red zone processes, now we've bumped it up to 6. I said 5 mechanisms and I walked you through 5. The 6th one is this important notion of expansive cycles, virtuous cycles. There was the little feedback loop and then the larger expansive cycle. Those can be either thought of in a deficit mode, because that's not what was the program, or in an asset mode, which is that that's an asset, a community asset that can be leveraged for a number of reasons, towards a number of ends. Those mechanisms then, using the same diagram, show up in a number of key places. The little squiggly lines are indicating where you see them. The restorative topophilia and urgent biophilia, sort of yin and yang thing I said, is happening right out of the gate, generally speaking. And it starts to manifest itself pretty quickly. Later, these memorialization mechanisms happen around the time when people are starting to cluster together. Are they going to memorialize an event, a person, a place? Those are questions. And knowing the answer to those questions is going to be pretty important to whatever activities are going to be attempted to be constructed on the ground. Later, as those memorialization activities occur and these interesting little feedbacks start happening here, then you start getting this symbols and ritual mechanism really kicking in. And everybody knows the power of symbols. So symbolic representations are very important. And I think I would say in the reconstruction context, keeping track of what is becoming a symbol and what those symbols are being used for in terms of ritual or reconstructing or recovering identities is an important thing to be aware of, regardless of your objectives. Finally, the virtuous cycle mechanism, the 6th one that I've added, shows up both here in this smaller sub-cycle or system within a system, and it also shows up in this larger expansive cycle that's happening at the societal scale. So, I've been asked by a number of people where I give this talk, what's the recipe for getting something like this going if we wanted to do something like this after some sort of perturbation? What we learned in Japan was that the recipe looks something like this. This is a working draft. This is not a final version. First thing is this remember part. Remember that the relationships people have with nature are important. In any activity that you're doing after a disaster or perhaps after conflict, remember that part is important because it's often forgotten in an effort to get the lights back on and the roads functioning and the airport up. That part's often forgotten or underappreciated. Next is to recognize that people want to be a part of restoring their own home, their own town, their own country. So find ways to encourage them to engage. And one of the ways to do that, one easy way to do that is through this sort of greening in the red zone. The third is a decision point. And that's a decision that these relationships that people have with nature are important to the recovery and rebuilding. That is a decision that not everybody's willing to make. Some people are going to say right out of the gate, negative. That is not important to this mission. We do not care. That's a nice to do. And that's a mistake in my opinion. The next part of the recipe is the learn part. The learn part happens through a sort of participatory approach where you're reaching out to communities that are benefiting right now in real time from greening in the red zone, from whatever processes are occurring on the ground. Next is investment. Once you've identified all that and are able to say, I think we can shape this in a good way, you must invest in those community processes where reconstruction of nature is part of the recovery because of all the things that we've talked about in this talk. Then finally, it's important to document and celebrate these greening activities, and those are for some of the morale reasons that we talked about earlier, and then capitalize on those feedbacks and virtuous cycles and expansive cycles as a part of what you're programming. So it's an iterative model. It's not a model where it starts at T-minus 0 and goes to here and we're done. Doesn't work that way in this case. It's an iterative, constantly revisiting and using this sort of greening in the red zone approach as a way to address the issue. For those of you that are specifically researching reconstruction or post-conflict recovery or those kinds of things, I think this is important to that research domain because it's an explicit example of how important this interdependence that humans have with the rest of nature actually is in the equation. This is an underappreciated point. There is, unfortunately, a larger issue, sort of an epistemological or philosophical one, that says that we humans are separate from nature. We're exempt from its laws and rules and exceptional and all the rest. And it's up to you whether you believe that or not. But at the end of the day, after a disaster or in conflict, it's pretty clear that we're capable of being wiped out as individuals or as neighborhoods by whatever the force is. So this explicit example of the critical importance of this human interdependence with the rest of our ecosystem is an important addition to this research domain. And also the power of acknowledging this innate biophilia and love of life and love of place are as very powerful responses that people on the ground are going to have to conflict or disaster is an important thing to acknowledge in terms of understanding the morale equation, or the human terrain as it's often called. Third, it points to the importance of remembering and reconstituting our own ecological identities as the bringer of aid. And that's an important component too, as the bringer of assistance. And then I think it's important also to point out that it's an optimistic approach. It is not a deficit approach. It's an asset-based approach that has the potential to mitigate structural violence and replace it with at least the idea, if not the reality, of sustainable coexistence. So, concluding, here's a quote. This quote comes from a book that was published quite a while ago now. Trying to find out when. I'd say it was a late 80s, The Greening of Peace Research. Emerging consensus, this guy's talking about, that the changing relationship between human beings and the sustaining capabilities of the global ecosystem is becoming a source itself of human suffering. And the concerns of peace research, if you're interested in that domain, should similarly shift away from weaponry and military conflict to new sources of conflict and misery within the limited capabilities of the global environment. So that harkens back to one of the earlier slides about population, climate change, scarcity. The sort of CIA projection reports are talking about these things as the water war of the future and these other things. And I think that what we're seeing now is sort of a convergence in a number of fields about this. It might be the time to think about ideas like greening in the red zone, both from an ecological and environmental standpoint and from a societal standpoint. So with that, I will stop talking at you, and maybe listen to some things you might have to say. We started a little late. We got about 5 minutes. I don't know, Kelly, it's up to you how long we go, but I'm open to any questions or comments that you might have. And thank you very much for staying with me for this hour. Appreciate that. Questions, comments?
I was thinking something about 6 months ago. I like to do environmental things. I'm also a tree steward for the city here. But I noticed something very interesting I never knew before, that they found out in cities the low oxygen level is very low. And to go to the countryside, get more oxygen so you feel better and everything. So that's another factor, too.
That's right. That is a factor. Good point.
Thank you so much, Keith. This is wonderful. And I'm there was so much that you said, and I'm still thinking about it, so this is not going to be coherent. But I'm just interested in this notion of temporality, and it's linked to the system, as you had a diagram. And in this, the way you talked about red zone not having a definite end to some extent, and green in this case begins with the red. You separate them analytically to talk about them, but they are actually overlapping in time and space. So I'm thinking how, because intensity here matters, right? And it seems to me somehow the green sometimes is the most intense actually in the time of red. And then something happens in post-war, so-called post-war era, when there is green becomes almost depleted to some extent through socioeconomic neoliberal policies or whatever you have it. And then I'm thinking about how red extends into green, if you wish, and how oftentimes this engagement, this active collective mobilization around the green, how oftentimes red speaks to them through landmines and polluted waters from chemicals. And so I'm interested in a messier relationship between this green and red in terms of temporality, because you're hinting at temporality of this. But I just analytically, I would like you to talk a little bit more about this. Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I appreciate the messiness. I think that one of the traps with talking about greening in the red zone is that the red zone in most of these cases is a pretty sudden flip of the system. It's a threshold cross, it's something like this. But that discounts an entire suite of other kinds of slow burn red zones. And I mentioned I grew up in Detroit. We originally had recently got some funding to do some comparative work on these sudden sort of red zones versus a slow burn. And because we think exactly as you're beginning to articulate that there's big differences, both on the urgency of greening and how it emerges, and on whether it does in an urgent way when the disaster is a slow motion disaster, like economic decline or sort of social economic issues. In Detroit, what we wanted to look at was, you got 40 or 50 years of what people have called a slow motion Sandy, I think they called it, or slow motion Katrina, and that was the word. It was a slow motion Katrina that hit Detroit, and they've used terminology like it's a battle zone, it's a war zone, it's a disaster area. They're using all this terminology, but there was no sudden thing, no red zone thing that happened to Detroit. And you can pick a town in the Rust Belt, and it would be the same story. And I think in the international context, you would have similar stories. So I don't know that even the same sort of processes, those mechanisms even apply there. At some level, there is, I would hypothetically think there would be biophilia and topophilia in these things, but do they manifest themselves at the same level of urgency? And then what does that mean in that equation? So I am totally on board with the problem of this messiness. We need more empirical work to now, so there's 35 chapters here positing something. It's time for graduate students to pick this thing up and go attack some of those issues, especially the temporal ones, I think. Or the magnitude ones. What's the difference? Is there what's the difference in terms of impact and the level of greening you might see? That's all I can really say, other than to appreciate the messiness, because I think it's the question of the day, at least for our lab, is how do we get there?
It resonates with something that you say, that oftentimes this is overlooked in policy, that if people in those war zones that sometimes extend for a decade, right, are creating these kinds of relationships that you're talking about, and then the post-war tends to categorize, classify, urbanize, whatever you want. That kind of experience, something is reduced. So instead of actually mobilizing on what happens in the red in terms of green, something is being somehow narrowed and almost decapitated.
That's exactly. I think that's a structural problem from the West that doesn't appreciate the interdependence I talked about in those last couple of slides. We just continue to think about it as the nice little cherry on top of the sundae. It's a nice to do. It's an also-ran. It's not fundamental. Our relationships with that landscape or that environment aren't fundamental. And once we get the lights back on and everything seems back to normal, yeah, that was nice. Those community gardens were nice. Now let's get back to building the high-rises and whatnot. Fine. Development, economics, I get it. But we can't leave behind, the sort of environmental component, because that was, in fact, that catalytic thing that helped us get back from the brink. So the messiness is obvious. it really has to do with coming up with a new language to talk about the value of these natural resources in this sort of context. I appreciate the comment and question. A couple of questions.
Okay, well, let me just add to the messiness a little bit more. Most of the examples that you've given here seem to suggest that a lot of this activity is grassroots, kind of NGO, civil society related. But if you look at the long-term history of greening in North America, many times that has been an elite-backed project. And especially if you look at the history of urban parks. Most of those were started by the elite to sort of add cultural jewels to the urban milieu. And there was a very specific agenda at hand, and that was basically to enhance property values and also to, and I guess as a collateral to that, it was to raise up the tax base in order to do other projects. So greening, in that historical sense, becomes part of a trickle-down agenda. And so I'm wondering if you've found any, I guess, debates over, this is sort of regime theory related, debates between different ideologies as to how to make this stuff happen. And in some places post-disaster, it's very egalitarian, but then in other places, it's very elitist. Did that make any sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It made a lot of sense. I appreciate the comment and the question that came at the end. The optics that you bring to the discussion are important. I am very cognizant. I think there's 2 chapters in there that talk about community gardening movements as one of those mechanisms, discourses of defiance, so in direct opposition to the Olmsted projects, et cetera. In New York City, in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, in post-World War II Europe, the community gardening movement was often sort of the antithesis of the kind of basically gentrification project that greening became to be known as.
That's where my worry is with some of this, is that this all sounds really great and cuddly, and is it another way of getting the masses to kind of buy into something that ultimately could lead to gentrification? Because if you look at the leisure studies literature, it's very clear, some of the studies that have been done, that there is this econometric kind of value or that you can ascribe to the creation of parks and gardens. And I worry that this could kind of further that social agenda, which ultimately is not very egalitarian.
Or resilient.
Or resilient.
That's exactly not in a normative sense. It's not very resilient.
Exactly.
I agree. I think that the danger with this greening in the red zone approach, and my sort of hybrid background coming out of some of those policy circles and the military background, is you could easily use this as a big psyop, and boom, you're good to go, and you got what you wanted in place X. But you shouldn't, because it will only last for a little while. And so I think that there's a couple of papers that we've dealt with this. They're both, environment shaping is the key words if you wanted to look for these, that deal with specifically the questions that you're raising, and how the danger, the slippery slope would be that it would fall into a sort of tyranny of participation manipulation program, which is not what we're talking about. And what we're trying to identify, obviously, are community-based natural resources projects that can be leveraged, but leveraged in a participatory way with a sort of iterative process. Probably need to do a better job, especially with the feedback that you've just given, putting that up front so that people don't get the sense that maybe we're just talking about a psyop here, a project of manipulation similar to sort of older last century gentrification projects in urban environments. So I appreciate that. I don't think there's a real easy solution. I think it all depends on what the government or the coalition of governments, who they are and what their agenda is, and to what extent they're willing to be participatory in the reconstruction activity and bring in those ecological elements because they think it's the appropriate way to proceed, not that it's the convenient way to exploit.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Sure. Were you? Yes, you were next.
Well, it was just a very quick question. Actually, that question was really interesting.
So actually, I'm going to ask a question off of that. Would it be the type of greening that really makes the difference? Because you mentioned sort of two types of greening that actually maybe they were at opposite poles. Because Olmstedism or capability brown in England, I mean that's one. That's taking an environment and gentrifying it in a certain way, and for property values and so on and so forth. And then there are things like community gardens or allotments, which are, it's sort of a different, maybe from a different socioeconomic place. That, would that make it, that sort of thing make a difference? Or egalitarian, like the path along the Berlin Wall, which I just saw in your book.
Right here.
Oh, sorry, I was just.
So it's a great point, and again, it differs in each location. The image that you see on this book is this sort of looks like, oh, it's a round community garden. That's a bomb crater at Westminster Abbey. During World War II. I think that to me epitomizes what we're talking about. So it's the old lemonade out of lemon sort of thing, and you can see it. You know it when you see it. I don't know what the metrics are yet for how you say is it a government project or is it a community-led thing. You just sort of know it when you see it. I think there's some way we have to get to policymakers, commanding officers and whoever else is on the ground to sort of get sensitized perhaps to what is that. When we see these greening in the red zone things, they must have some characteristics. I'm working on that. And what they aren't and what they are. And then how are those leveraged but in a participatory way that doesn't put you in a position of looking exploitive? I think that's kind of where this is all headed.
Don't just go in there and make a beautiful park.
Oh yeah, if you go in there with a big national parks project,
right,
you might fail miserably.
Right. Which is,
you're greening though, quote unquote.
And that's one of your examples, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And in that particular case, in an isolated sense, it was mostly successful, the first national park in Afghanistan. Because it was a community-led thing. Now, it's a tragic story. If you read that chapter, somebody dies that is not a combatant as a result of their passion for that space and that place. So, there's a lot of dynamics involved in these kinds of things, of course. But, that may be appropriate for that place. But the way you know is because it's a participatory approach. The people said, these are the places we value. These are the relationships with our natural environment that we care about restoring. Here's our memorialization mechanism, what we want to remember. Here's what we would like to forget, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I can't emphasize enough that part and parcel with this approach is a highly participatory, genuine participatory sort of approach.
This is more of a comment rather than sort of a question. Maybe, and also maybe you can elucidate where the research is going to go. One thing that struck me about your talk, which was really fascinating, was the lack of discussion about gender and masculinity. It was very much about governments, and in post-conflict situation, we are talking about masculine governments. And my concern would be that sometimes if you're going in and you're doing this ecological or environmental rebuilding, you're essentially empowering a certain social structure that would disempower one group over the other. So I'm curious to know if any thought is going into that. How are you going to address those disparities between those communities?
I really appreciate that observation. I'm not to the point, I wouldn't say that our lab is to the point of giving thought to implementation recommendations on this kind of stuff quite yet. So the honest short answer would be no, because we're not really thinking about implementation yet. Observationally, though, I can say that in many cases, in many of the examples of greening in the red zone, in terms of the very basic gender discussion, these things are started by the elder women in the community. And especially in African examples, one of the unfortunate realities is they have the idea. They're the ones we talk to in this sort of participatory mode. They say, this is what the problem is, we need water, we can't spend all our day running back and forth from wells, then we could educate our kids, and you know the story. And when it's time to come do some sort of intervention or help out, the dudes with the cell phones show up. And then it's over. And the people that we would expect to be marginalized are then marginalized. I don't have an answer for how that gets fixed right now, but I recognize that it's a serious problem. And I don't know how to change the discourse around the subject matter because it does reek of masculinity at some level. Of course, I'm a male. That doesn't help in terms of reeking of masculinity at some level. But you know, there is certainly a reality that a lot of this community-based activity starts with the elders in the community who are, in general, no matter what continent you're on, the women. It's true of the community gardens in New York City, for the most part. It's often true in Africa, you know, whatever the scale of the project is. It has been true in Latin American countries, as to our observation. Beyond that, I am not a gender scholar. I don't know the vocabulary necessarily, but I would appreciate anybody that is a gender scholar helping out with this as we think about implementation, because certainly that's a significant concern. You'll help? Great. Thank you.
And I had that note as well, gender and age. I mean, you're constantly saying elderly women, and there are all these complications that need to be fleshed out. So.
And the elder issue is interesting because in the case of these very short spaced red zones, unfortunately the youth are engaged, and they're engaged either in the military or protesting the military. They're generally, not always, but generally not the ones that are going out and worrying about the trees at that time, at that moment. Later, they pick up the baton and really get behind the tree planting initiative or whatever it is. But at that very moment, they seem to be, at least this is anecdotal observation, occupied. Temporarily. Exactly. Anybody?
You talked about how greening red zones contributes to recovery and resilience. You also mentioned that it contributes to resistance. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, so are you familiar with the resilience literature? Are you kind of getting into that a little bit?
No.
Okay. So resilience is the ability for a system to retain its function and endure. Not necessarily the sort of pop science version of like elasticity or something. Retain. Resistance means that it's related, but that there's some outside force that's trying to change something, and you just sort of stand in. And that's a little different than adaptation. There's nuance there, and they are very close. So resistance in some cases is better than adaptation. You know, there are some interesting little placards I've been seeing. I did my dissertation work in New Orleans after Katrina. People down there are starting to put signs up on their street posts saying, "Stop calling me resilient." Because they feel like resilience has become a project to say, just suck it up and be resilient. And so, you know, inequity continues. So resistance is now where they're moving. They're going to resist the discourse of resilience. So there's a very fine nuance in there that I think I'm trying to point to here, and also recognize that we have to be very, very clear about the vocabulary that we're using when we're talking about resilience. Do we mean pop science resilience that the New York Times uses to say how resilient Manhattan is to Hurricane Sandy? Or do we mean social ecological system resilience as a property of a system? So what I'm talking about there, in answer to your question, when I use resilience, I'm talking about a larger social ecological system property. And when I'm talking about resistance, I'm talking mostly about social resistance to whatever perturbation we might be discussing. And I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. There's some really interesting literature on that subject.
We have a small gift for you. Open it now, but please join me.